king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Jeff Mason, but Fred always called me Jeffrey, so I better stick to that for now. Frederick Harold Rothery was born on July 2nd, 1924, in Leeds, Yorkshire, England, in the home of his maternal grandparents. His mother, Ethel Thompson, had returned home from Sudbury, Ontario to visit her family and show them her 15-month-old daughter, Mary. Ethel had followed her sweetheart, Frank Rothery, to Canada shortly after the First World War. They'd married, and Frank had settled in Sudbury, where Frank became the town's health inspector, and eventually also lieutenant governor of the local militia. Early in this visit to England, it was discovered that Ethel was expectant. Because she was terribly sick whenever she traveled at sea, and she'd suffered 3 miscarriages before Marion's birth, the decision was made to remain with the family in England until after the delivery. Fred didn't come home to Sudbury until he was 6 weeks old in August of 1924. He lived in Sudbury for the next 81 years, coming to Manitoulin Island in 2005 when health problems forced Marion to give up their apartment in Sudbury. Those are the facts, just the facts. And they come far short of actually telling the rather remarkable story that was Fred's life. With the unfailing support of his family, he thrived through an unprecedented number of social changes that saw him become a bit of a pioneer. I hope I'm up to the task this morning of describing his journey for you. Fred would have been a toddler when it became apparent that he was what we would now call developmentally disabled. His walking, talking, and toilet training were all well behind schedule. Medical advice was sought, including trips to Toronto for consultations with the highly respected Dr. Alan Brown. This was not an easy task. Highway 69 wasn't built for another 25 years. Traveling to Toronto was an arduous 2-day journey via North Bay, much of it on rather horrible dirt roads. Opinions were consistent. Fred had suffered brain damage during a difficult delivery. His development would always be limited. His condition was permanent. In Sudbury in the 1920s, it wasn't expected that a family would choose to keep such an individual at home. The province had opened a number of large institutions in places such as Smiths Falls and Orillia, and that's where people such as Fred were supposed to go, so the family could move on with their lives. It's always been my understanding that Ethel and Frank's decision to keep Fred at home cost them a few friendships. They certainly were people who felt that it was wrong, something that just wasn't done. As far as I know, they never regretted their decision. Fred's charms were already at work. It would be wrong for me to paint a completely rosy picture of Fred's childhood. Marion was regularly forced to be his defender when Fred was enrolled in the first class for slow children in the Sudbury school system, and he immediately became the target for bullies and others who saw him as the perfect victim. Watching out for Fred was her preoccupation until just 11 days ago. Fred did, however, thrive in his own way. He walked with an unusual gait that was recognized by many around Sudbury, and which could wear out the heels on a pair of work boots in a matter of days, but which he could keep up for many miles. As his school days came to an end, his parents looked for ways to keep him busy. The chances for real employment seemed rather bleak, but for a number of years he had a very large route delivering the Sudbury Star. His abilities to organize things in his own fashion began to emerge. Although he couldn't keep written notes about his route and its very many customers, he had it memorized perfectly, and he could tell something about every person, such as their size, if that was unusual, or who they were related to, or if they gave him a treat from time to time, and if so, what the treat was likely to be. Fred's entry into more conventional employment came in 1947. The Cressys, family friends for many years, asked if Fred could fill in for a few weeks at their local business, Journal Printing. He'd only be needed while the regular employee was on vacation. Frank and Ethel thought it was something that he could perhaps handle, so they agreed. And for the next 39 years, Fred was a familiar figure walking downtown Sudbury delivering completed printing jobs. It turned out that among the strengths he quietly developed was an encyclopedic knowledge of local businesses and where they were. The expression "happy in his work" could have been created for Fred and his job at the Journal. The other longtime employees became a second family to him. When he retired in 1986, he was given a lovely dinner, a framed certificate honoring his time with the company, and an engraved watch which never left his wrist except for the few stressful occasions when it had to go away for repair. Fred's life changed drastically in 1958 when his father died suddenly. Ethel didn't cope well with being a widow. She wasn't looking after her health, and it was decided that Marion, her husband Joe Mason, and the children, Frank, Jeffrey, and Dorothy, would move for Levac, where Joe worked underground for ECO, to join Ethel and Fred at 380 John Street in Sudbury. Overnight, Fred became the live-in uncle for three children, ages 2, 4, and 7. So it was that we came to live with Uncle Fred until we left home years later as adults to take up our various independent lives. This blended family also led to new experiences for Fred, like camping every summer across Canada and the northern states, sharing a tent with Frank and I, while his miniature mother slept on the front seat of the car, and Dorothy and our parents were in a second tent. These were pretty novel experiences for him, especially to begin in his mid-30s. But with few exceptions, he rose to the challenge quite happily. When you grow up with a disabled person in the family, no one ever sits you down and explains how he or she is different. No one needs to. You absorb the differences and what they mean in the routines of your life. As we each began to acquire reading skills, we realized this meant that when there were things that had to be read, in stores, restaurants, in the newspaper, we could now provide Uncle Fred with help as he needed it. We also learned that this was only to be done gently, subtly, without ever embarrassing him. I believe these lessons made us better people, more understanding and sensitive. Some of the things we learned from living with Fred were harder to take. I remember very well how disappointing it was to realize that if Fred went to certain stores to buy something, there was never going to be any change, no matter how much money he took on the errand. It hurt to learn that the same storekeepers, who'd always seemed so nice, didn't hesitate to take advantage of him. We took for granted that if Uncle Fred said, rather tersely, "He's not a nice man. I don't like him," in an agitated fashion, then there was a very good reason for this opinion. It was a pretty strong character condemnation in our family when Fred spoke up against someone. It worked the other way as well. When Marion found the love of her life in Joe Mason, her father was less than thrilled. He made it clear that he had hoped that his only daughter would find a husband who was something more than an hourly employee working underground in the mines. Marion made it equally clear that she had no doubt that this was the man who would make her happy. Her father thought he might have a niece in the hole, asking Fred, "What do you think of this Joe Mason?" The answer, "I like him. He's good to me," wasn't what the Colonel had hoped for, but it helped to seal the deal for Joe and Marion. I say helped because before agreeing to the marriage, Marion had to be sure that Joe understood that Fred would always be a part of their lives. Joe agreed and became a stalwart supporter and true friend of Fred until his own death in 1987. Like many disabled people, Fred made his way through life with great assistance from routines. Once they were mastered, they were completed correctly from then on without variation. Within our family's stories, there are notable instances of how this worked, not always as expected. Automobiles were not very common in the 1930s, but because of his work as the city health inspector, Frank Rothery had a car as soon as they were available. In those days, before the advent of antifreeze, people drained the radiator every night in freezing weather. His father taught Fred how to do it, opening the tap at the bottom of the rad as the car sat in the driveway, after he came home for supper. As was typical with Fred, once he'd mastered what was expected, the chore could be forgotten about. He'd perform it like clockwork from then on. Even on the memorable night when his father came home with the cooling system full of new, expensive antifreeze, which he forgot to mention to Fred. Needless to say, it was all promptly drained down the driveway. I have very few memories of Uncle Fred getting upset, but strangely enough, Christmas morning could be one of these occasions. Fred always had a bedside clock. It dictated the start of every day, one time being appropriate for getting out of bed on work days, and another, later time, for non-work days. Variations to this schedule were in no way appropriate. I clearly remember Nana Rothery, his mother, calling up the stairs for Fred to come down so the openings of stockings and presents could begin. With 3 small children chomping at the bit, I assumed the pressure was significant. Uncle Fred was not impressed. He replied, "I don't get up yet, not working today." Things were at an impasse until Nana threatened, I'll come up there and box your ears." The threat in itself was quite comical. Fred was a healthy 6 feet tall. His mother stretched to her maximum, barely touched 4'6". But nevertheless, she prevailed, and a rather unhappy Uncle Fred came downstairs, joined the rest of us, and quickly got into the spirit of the day, forgiving the disruptions to his routines. At the start of this eulogy, I said that Fred was a bit of a pioneer. He was one of the first mentally disabled people to stay in Sudbury and lead a relatively public life. I remember bringing friends home in high school and having them invariably comment that they recognized my uncle. They might not know his name, but like so many others, they'd grown up seeing him walking the streets of Sudbury. He was Freddie to more people than anyone knew. He began his life labeled with words that we would now only recognize as completely inappropriate. He became mentally retarded and lived long enough to join the ranks of the developmentally delayed. When that term surfaced, I remember thinking, whoa, that is some delay. I don't think he's ever catching up. But he managed to fool us sometimes. When Fred was about 75, he and my mother drove down to Perth to visit me and my family. She arrived shaking her head to tell us that before leaving, she'd given Fred his marching orders. Okay, we've got to carry all these suitcases down the hall to the elevator, go down 10 floors to the lobby, carry them through the lobby, out, down the parking lot to the car. This is a lot of work. After some hesitation, Fred replied, maybe I shouldn't say this, but how about I stay in the lobby with the suitcases, you bring the car to the door. It made Marion laugh as she wondered just who had the delay. Fred Rothery was a gentle, kind, happy person with a big, hello, how are you today? And an enthusiastic smile for everyone he encountered throughout his life. Whether you met him on the streets of Sudbury or in the lobby of the Manor in Little Current, you were sure to be greeted warmly. As far as I know, he never intentionally did an unkind thing in his life. That is quite a legacy. Thank you, Uncle Fred. We will never forget.